Welcome to our fifth and our final week of the campaign on spiritual combat. Last week I told you that we were kind of dealing with the no-brainer week, because if we ask about spiritual combat, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Well, obviously we need to pray. Well, if you want week 5, this is our second no-brainer week in the week of spiritual combat. It's a continuation, if you want, on what we discussed last week. And what we're going to talk about is the importance of, when we pray, keeping in mind the passion of Jesus, the suffering, the death, the resurrection of Jesus. Now, I want you to stretch your memory banks a little bit. How many of you remember a few years ago, maybe 10 years ago, roughly, when the movie The Passion of the Christ came out? Okay? Do you remember how much of a big deal that was? Do you remember what people were saying about it? How much of a commotion one simple movie made? Well, what were some of the things that people were saying? Well, first of all, you had a lot of people against it. First of all, people were saying it's anti-Semitic. It's going to paint the Jewish people in a bad light. People are saying the movie's too violent, as if all the other violent movies out there weren't too violent. It's too violent, though, and it's horrifying, and we shouldn't be looking at that kind of thing. Some people just said it's too boring. Some people said it's exaggerated. People came up with every conceivable excuse why we shouldn't be seeing this. But at the same time, we also saw a whole other phenomena of miracles that were taking place because of that movie. Actually, if you listen to the actors who were involved in it, a good percentage of the actors in the movie were ordinary men and women, but some of them were living vices. Some of them were really pretty far away from the church, and a lot of them had serious conversions in their lives. A lot of them, because of that movie, got their acts together in their spiritual life. They started going to Mass regularly in confession and spiritual direction, and they started really making a turnaround. I heard stories about men who had committed violent crimes. Maybe some guy in the United States, I forget, he'd committed murder, and he got away with it. And years later, that movie came out, and watching it, he realized, Jesus died for my sins. And he turned himself in. He went to the police and said, even though I got away with it, I have to turn myself in. People who have had miraculous conversions simply because of looking at, through the eyes of Mel Gibson this time, but looking at face to face, this is what Jesus did for me. And all of the saints are really unanimous on this. If we want to get to know Christ, if we want to get holy, we need to really, a lot of saints say every day, keep before our eyes the passion of Jesus, the suffering, the death, the resurrection of Jesus, what he did for me. Because when a person is willing to do something difficult for us, that's when we know there is love, Going to Disney World with somebody does not necessarily show a lot of love, because a lot of people would like that. It's not a hard thing to do for most people. But when it's time to do the difficult thing, time to do those jobs that nobody wants to do, time to clean up around the house, something as simple as that. When there's a person who's willing to step up for those jobs, that's when there is love. It actually kind of reminds me, I was having a conversation not too long ago, Father Jose Felix, and we were discussing some of the parishioners and the things we do in the parish. And one of the people that was present in the discussion discussed, there are your blue-collar parishioners and your white-collar parishioners. The blue-collar parishioners, he was joking, but he says, blue-collar parishioners are the ones when it's time to get a job done who step up. And the white-collar parishioners can be those of us who sometimes, well, as long as it's the job I feel like doing, maybe I'll do it, but maybe if it's the job I don't feel like doing so much, I don't get my hands dirty. And that was kind of an innocent joke. But it can be true of all of us in every dimension of life. We can either be blue-collar Catholics if you want, or white-collar Catholics. When Jesus wants us to get our hands dirty, are we willing to get our hands dirty? Well, if we're people who are willing to do the things that are difficult, that's a good sign that there is love. Now, following Father Scupoli, in his book, he says, what are the fruits? What are the things we get out of meditating on Jesus' suffering, death, and resurrection. And, again, Father Scupoli, he's very well organized, and he gives you a lot of different points. So in today's talk, you're going to get a whole lot of little points again. What are the fruits of meditating on Jesus' suffering, death, and resurrection? First of all, Father Scupoli tells us that it gives us real sorrow for our sins. Let's go back to the example that we gave of the man who had committed the murder, who turned himself in years after he had committed the murder simply by watching the movie The Passion of the Christ. Well, what happened? It granted him that gift of really repenting of his sin, of understanding this was the price of my sin. And related to that is going to be a desire to change. When we are naturally sorry for having sinned, the natural consequence is going to be, well, I'm not going to sin again. I'm going to start again. I want a new life. Thirdly, again, it's just pretty much the same point. We will attack, therefore, the vices that stop us from living with virtue, attack those vices that lead us to sinning and that eventually led to Jesus' suffering and death and resurrection. And then finally, we're going to decide we're actually going to get to work and practice virtue. Now, Father Scupoli, he says, he's not telling us, he's not directing us in a meditation, but he tells us there is a certain plan, there's a method that he uses that is really powerful and can really help you and me also to be men and women who pray well, especially when it's time to contemplate Jesus' passion. He says, first of all, and we can do this with any particular virtue that we're interested in using. Let's say I'm going to meditate on the patience of Jesus. He says, well, first of all, if I'm going to meditate on the patience of Jesus, point A is meditate on how did God act towards Jesus in light of patience, okay? How did God the Father act towards Jesus? And after we meditate on that for a while, we can use our own thoughts, we can use our imagination, we can put in mind, a dialogue, if you want, between God the Father and God the Son, and the fact of Jesus becoming human. How did God treat him, and how did that foster the virtue of patience in Jesus? Secondly, well, how did Jesus act towards God his Father? Again, we can imagine things, we can paint the picture that we want, but imagine this dialogue, imagine the relationship between Jesus and his Father. Thirdly, then, is going to be, how did Jesus act, in a certain sense, toward himself? Which means, how was Jesus' patience when he was the one being tried? When he was on the cross, how did Jesus, in a certain sense, treat himself? How did he stand up to all of those temptations and trials? Fourthly, how did Jesus act towards me? What was the motivation behind his patience? How does Jesus deal with me patiently when I am the one who messes up, so to speak? And finally, we ask ourselves, well, what am I going to do towards Christ? So these 5 steps. How did God, Father, deal with Jesus? How did Jesus deal with the Father? How did Jesus, in a sense, treat himself? How does Jesus deal with me? And in the end, my resolution. How am I going to deal with Jesus? How am I going to pay him back, so to speak? Now, we mentioned that this is part 2 of the No-Brainer Week in our series on spiritual combat. What is the privileged place, the most important place, if you want, for us to be able to discover and to contemplate Jesus' suffering, his death, and his resurrection? It's going to be the Mass. And if you want more specifically, it's going to be in the Holy Eucharist. In the Eucharist, Father Scupoli uses the same image again that he told us. He said, in the Eucharist, more than any other place, it's not a matter of us picking up weapons to fight against Satan. It's a matter of the fact that Jesus himself is the weapon. Jesus himself is the one who picks up the weapons and fights for us. Jesus is the one who goes out on our behalf in the Eucharist to win those victories that you and I cannot win on our own. The Eucharist is our pledge of salvation. It's our pledge of victory. It's our promise. So Father Scupoli says, if we're going to be men and women who contemplate Jesus, let's bring it to the Eucharist, because the Eucharist is Jesus' self-offering. And when we're there with the Eucharist, well, how do we deal with Jesus in the Eucharist? What are the occasions that we have to spend time with him? Obviously, there are two primary places or two primary ways that we can have a Eucharistic devotion. The first is going to be by going to Mass and by receiving Jesus in communion. And Father Scupoli tells us, when we go to Mass, there are three different moments, if you want, in the Mass. There's before the Mass, during the Mass, and after the Mass. Or another way of looking at it is before communion, when we receive communion, and after receiving communion. Each one of those requires that I prepare. Before the Mass, what are the dispositions in my heart that I need? What are the things I need to be doing? Well, there's a big difference, for example, between just kind of running into the church at the last second, especially if you're late, and not really taking any time to prepare. But what would it be if each one of us made a resolution, you know what? I'm going to show up 5 minutes early for Mass. I'm going to make sure we show up early just so I can go to the chapel, or just so I can spend time here and pray. I'm going to spend 5 or 10 minutes just getting ready to receive the biggest gift of my life. What a difference that would make in the way that I take part in Mass, in the way that I receive Jesus when it's time for communion. Another thing that he mentions, which is critical, is, obviously if we have mortal sin on our conscience, or even if we don't have mortal sin, what would it be like if we all went to confession? What would it be like if we regularly were men and women who were going to the sacrament of pardon so that Jesus could cleanse us from our sins? Now, it is something very beautiful in this parish as a priest to spend so many hours in the confessional. So many people that come regularly to have their sins cleansed. But how much more beautiful would it be if all of us really had that disposition, not to get scrupulous and say, okay, well, I stepped on a bug or something, therefore I have to go to confession before I receive communion. That's false. But if I have serious sin, or if it's been a long time, or if I have some habit that just keeps nagging me and I just can't seem to get over it, how beautiful it would be to really make that a regular part, to frequently go to confession, to be able to receive Jesus well in the Eucharist. Secondly, during Mass, just one thing I'm going to point out, one way that we can, in a sense, receive Jesus well in communion is this. When I'm receiving Jesus, well, first of all, pay attention to what you're doing. It's an obvious thing. Actually try to be conscious of what we're doing. But when I'm receiving Jesus, go to him with a mentality of, how can I be changed? How can I let the Eucharist change me into a different person? Because when we are willing to be changed, and not just to ask for all kinds of favors, but for us to really be willing to get down and do something difficult and become different men and women, that shows that there's openness on our part to let God do whatever he wants. And that means that it's no longer so much about me, what I want. It's about, Lord, I want you to transform me into your good pleasure. That's a totally different way of going about things. And that's something that will really transform and revolutionize, if you want, the way we go to Mass. And then finally, after Mass, after communion, one thing we can ask is, what are my resolutions? Okay? Jesus just gave me a gift. Jesus gave me the biggest gift, the greatest gift he could give me. What are my resolutions going to be? What am I going to do afterward in order to let this love not just stay with me, but to touch other people, to let this love change society around me, to let this love change me? What am I going to do to let Jesus make a difference in my life and in the lives of others? And that's going to be the best preparation we can have in turn to get ready for the next time. Constantly to have resolutions in our spiritual life and really try to do what we can to practice them. Finally, when we talk about Eucharistic life, when we talk about devotion to the Eucharist, obviously it's always a good idea if we actually go and spend a little time in front of him. And again, St. Peter, St. Denis, we regularly have Eucharistic adoration. Every Tuesday, all day long, every Friday, all day long, and then frequently, for other occasions, we try to have the Blessed Sacrament there. We have a beautiful adoration chapel over on the side of the main church. It's there so that you can go and spend time kneeling before the tabernacle. Let's try to really be a parish where everybody lives a deep Eucharistic life, where everybody finds ways to spend with Jesus. And when we do that, this will become a parish where lives are changed, where the diocese is touched, where so many great things can happen, all because we put Jesus in the center. One last point, I would like to invite you very much to a couple of activities that are coming up in order to help you get ready for Holy Week. First of all, we have a mission coming up. It's going to be this Saturday at 9 in the morning. So if you want to take part in a door-to-door mission, we talked about, okay, after Mass, what am I going to do? What's my resolution? How am I going to be a different person? Well, how great it would be to go out and to take part in that mission. Secondly, like we said, why don't you make a resolution? Promise Jesus, I'm going to spend some time here this week. Even if I'm just driving by on the way home, I'm going to swing by, I'm going to go out of my way for 5 or 10 minutes just to say hello to you in the Eucharist. I promise you, you will not leave disappointed. And finally, we have confessions coming up. Because we're getting ready for Holy Week, the next Monday from 4 in the evening until 9 in the evening, it is our penitential service where we have multiple priests who are going to be here hearing confessions. Come make us work. We don't want to be bored. We want you to, if we're going to be here ready to hear confessions, well, the least you can do is give us something to do. That'll be a great way to get ready for Holy Week. It'll be a great way to celebrate the Easter mysteries. It'll be a great way to fight our spiritual combat. God bless you all.